The champagne glass trembled in my hand as I stood frozen behind the mahogany doors of Robert Rivera's study, listening to him destroy my reputation one devastating word at a time. She's nothing but a small-town opportunist who saw dollar signs. The moment she met Marcus, his voice boomed with absolute certainty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Mark my words, Patricia. That girl calculated every move. From day one. The sweet act, the shy smiles, even the way she dresses down to seem humble. It's all performance. The responding murmur of agreement from his wife made my stomach lurch. 3 years of trying to earn their respect. 3 years of biting my tongue through passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled insults, and this was what they truly thought of me. But what came next would change everything between us forever. The rain drummed against the windows of the cozy coffee shop in downtown Portland, where I first met Marcus Rivera 2.5 years ago. I was hunched over my laptop, frantically working on a logo design for a local bakery, my third client that week. Freelance graphic design wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me the freedom to work from anywhere. The coffee shop had become my second office, partly because their Wi-Fi was reliable and partly because the background noise helped me focus. I'd grown up in Bozeman, Montana, where my father worked double shifts at the lumber mill and my mother cleaned houses. To make ends meet, they'd sacrificed everything to send me to community college, where I'd studied graphic design with dreams bigger than our small town could contain. Moving to Portland had been terrifying and exhilarating, sleeping on my friend Amanda's couch, for 3 months until I could afford my own tiny studio apartment above a vintage bookstore. That rainy Tuesday, I was so absorbed in perfecting the curve of a croissant illustration that I didn't notice the tall, dark-haired man approaching my table until he spoke. "Excuse me." His voice was warm, slightly hesitant. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I couldn't help noticing your work. That design is incredible." I looked up to find the most genuine smile I'd ever seen, belonging to someone who seemed completely unaware of how striking he was. Marcus Rivera was everything I wasn't expecting to find in Portland. He was an architect working for a respected firm downtown, but there was nothing pretentious about him. He wore a simple button-down shirt with sleeves rolled up, revealing hands that were clearly familiar with both drafting pencils and actual construction work. When he asked if he could buy me coffee and talk about design, I almost said no. Dating hadn't been a priority when I was barely scraping together rent money each month. But something about his enthusiasm for my work, the way he leaned forward with genuine interest as I explained my creative process, made me forget about my usual reservations. We talked for 3 hours that day about art, architecture, dreams, and the challenges of building something meaningful in a competitive city. He listened when I spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and shared his own struggles with balancing artistic vision against commercial demands. Our first official date was at a food truck pod, splitting fish tacos and discussing our favorite buildings in the city. Marcus pointed out architectural details I'd never noticed, while I showed him how graphic design principles influenced everything from street signs to storefront layouts. He was impressed that I'd moved across the country with nothing but determination and a portfolio, calling it brave in a way that made me feel proud rather than foolish. For months, our relationship felt like the most natural thing in the world. Marcus would pick me up after work in his well-worn Honda Civic, and we'd explore hiking trails in the Columbia River Gorge or spend Sunday mornings wandering through art galleries. He lived modestly in a small apartment near his office, cooking dinner for us on weeknights and listening with genuine interest as I shared my latest client challenges. I fell in love with his kindness first, then his intelligence, and finally his unwavering support for my ambitions. When I landed my biggest contract designing marketing materials for a tech startup, Marcus celebrated like it was his own victory. When the project fell through due to the company's funding issues, leaving me short on rent, He quietly covered the difference without making me feel like a charity case. 6 months into our relationship, he mentioned his family owned a construction business, but he described it casually, like any other family occupation. My dad started Rivera Construction 30 years ago, he'd said while we were painting my apartment walls. It's grown quite a bit, but I've always been more interested in designing buildings than constructing them. Dad still hopes I'll join the family business someday. The way he spoke about his father carried a mixture of respect and gentle frustration that I recognized from my own relationship with my parents. They wanted the best for us, but couldn't always understand our choices. I assumed the Rivera family business was like most small construction companies, successful enough to support the family but nothing extravagant. My first clue that I'd misunderstood came when Marcus invited me to his childhood home for Sunday. Dinner. We drove through increasingly upscale neighborhoods until we reached a gated community in the West Hills. The Rivera estate sat on 3 acres overlooking the city, a stunning contemporary home that Marcus had actually helped design during his college internship with his father's architect. Robert Rivera was a man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. Tall and broad-shouldered like his son, but with silver hair and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they encountered. He owned the kind of presence that came from decades of running a successful business and making decisions that affected hundreds of employees. Patricia Rivera was elegant in a way that seemed effortless, but probably required considerable effort to maintain, with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothing that whispered expensive rather than shouting it. The house itself was a testament to impeccable taste and unlimited budget. Original artwork adorned the walls, and every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a design magazine. The kitchen where Patricia prepared our meal was larger than my entire apartment, with professional-grade appliances and countertops that gleamed under carefully positioned lighting. During that first dinner, I felt their eyes studying me with the intensity of people accustomed to evaluating potential investments. Robert asked polite questions about my background, my education, my career aspirations. When I mentioned growing up in Montana and my parents' blue-collar jobs, I watched something shift in his expression, though his courtesy never wavered. Patricia inquired about my apartment, my neighborhood, my lifestyle with the kind of curiosity that felt more like an inventory than genuine interest. When I described my studio above the bookstore, she exchanged a look with her husband that I pretended not to notice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversation felt like an interview where I wasn't entirely sure what position I was applying for. Marcus seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, chatting easily with his parents about his current projects and asking about the construction company's latest contracts. I learned that Rivera Construction wasn't just successful, it was one of the most respected commercial builders in the Pacific Northwest, responsible for several prominent buildings in Portland's skyline. The evening wasn't unpleasant exactly, but I left feeling like I'd been found lacking in some indefinable way. Marcus walked me to my car, apologizing for his parents' formality. "They take time to warm up to new people," he assured me, kissing my forehead. "They'll love you once they get to know you better." Over the following months, I tried desperately to prove myself worthy of their son. I dressed more conservatively. For family gatherings, researched topics I thought might interest them, and volunteered to help with family events. When Patricia mentioned needing someone to design new marketing materials for a charity auction, I offered my services for free, spending weeks creating elegant invitations and promotional pieces. The work was some of my best, incorporating sophisticated elements that matched the event's upscale audience while maintaining readability and visual appeal. Patricia accepted the designs with polite thanks, but no real enthusiasm. Later, I overheard her telling a friend that she'd had to make do with amateur work for the auction materials. Robert's disapproval was more subtle, but equally cutting. He'd ask pointed questions about my client base, my income, my long-term financial planning, with the tone of someone who already knew the answers were inadequate. When Marcus and I moved in together, Robert made comments about the wisdom of significant financial decisions that felt directed at me rather than his son. The criticism extended to seemingly innocent observations about my clothing, my car, my choice of restaurants when we went out as a family. Nothing was ever stated directly, but the message was clear. I wasn't sophisticated enough, successful enough, or wealthy enough to belong in their world. Marcus tried to shield me from the worst of it, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. During a family barbecue, I overheard Robert telling his business partner that Marcus was going through a phase and would come to his senses eventually. When I confronted Marcus about it later, he was genuinely upset and promised to speak with his father. The conversation apparently didn't go well. Marcus returned from his parents' house tight-lipped and frustrated, saying only that his father was set in his ways and needed time to adjust. The dynamic in our relationship began to shift as Marcus found himself constantly mediating between his family and me. I started declining invitations to family events, claiming work commitments or prior plans. The relief of not facing those evaluating stares was immediate, but it created new problems. Patricia began making comments about my absence, wondering aloud whether I was too busy for family or simply uninterested in being part of their lives. The situation reached a breaking point during Marcus's birthday celebration at an upscale restaurant his parents had chosen. I'd spent a week's income on a new dress, hoping to finally meet their standards of appropriate appearance. The evening started well enough, with Marcus genuinely happy to have everyone together, but deteriorated as Robert dominated the conversation with stories about successful business deals and wealthy family friends. When the conversation turned to Marcus's future, Robert made it clear he expected his son to eventually join Rivera Construction and settle down properly. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation, and I felt every eye at the table assessing whether I qualified as proper. Patricia added that she looked forward to planning a wedding that would reflect the family's standing in the community. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to compose myself before rejoining a conversation where I felt like an unwelcome observer rather than a participant. In the mirror, I saw a young woman trying too hard to be someone she wasn't, wearing a dress that cost more than she could afford to impress people who had already decided she was unworthy. That night, lying awake next to Marcus in our shared apartment, I made a decision that would change everything. I was tired of apologizing for my background, my income, my dreams that didn't align with their expectations. If Robert and Patricia Rivera believed I was a gold digger who had trapped their son, perhaps it was time to show them exactly who Natalie Brooks really was. The next morning, I called my financial advisor, David Kim, a friend from college who now worked for a wealth management firm. "David," I said, settling into my desk chair with my morning coffee, "I need you to prepare a comprehensive financial statement. Everything. And I need it to look official." His pause was telling. "Natalie, what's going on? You never talk about your finances, even with me." I took a deep breath, realizing I was about to reveal something I'd kept hidden for years, even from Marcus. It's time some people learned the truth about who they're dealing with. The story of my actual financial situation was one I'd never told anyone in Portland, partly from habit and partly from hard-learned wisdom about how money changed people's perceptions. Growing up in Bozeman, I'd watched wealthy tourists treat locals like servants, assuming that small town meant small-minded and poor meant worthless. My parents, despite their modest jobs, had been incredibly smart with money. My father hadn't. Just worked at the lumber mill. He'd invested every spare dollar in the company's stock options, slowly accumulating shares over 20 years. My mother's house cleaning business had grown into a successful service with 12 employees and contracts with several businesses. More significantly, my grandfather had been one of the early investors in a small tech company that eventually became a major player in cloud computing. When he passed away during my freshman year of college, He left me a trust fund that matured on my 25th birthday, just 6 months before I met Marcus. I'd used a small portion of the inheritance to move to Portland and establish my freelance business, but the bulk remained invested in growing. My modest lifestyle wasn't born of necessity but of choice. I'd seen how wealth could corrupt relationships and wanted to build something real with someone who loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. The irony of Robert Rivera's accusations wasn't lost on me. While he suspected me of being a gold digger pursuing his son's family money, the truth was that my net worth exceeded his by a considerable margin. The trust fund, combined with my grandfather's stock portfolio and my own careful investments, had grown to over $12 million. David worked quickly, preparing documents that would leave no doubt about my financial position. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property holdings I'd acquired but never mentioned, all presented in the kind of official format that even Robert Rivera would have to acknowledge. As I reviewed the papers in David's office, I felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. This revelation would change everything with Marcus's family, but it might also change things with Marcus himself. Would he be hurt that I'd hidden this part of my life? Would he question what else I hadn't told him? But living under the constant weight of Robert's disapproval, watching Marcus struggle to defend me against accusations that cut deeper each time, had become unbearable. If the truth disrupted our comfortable dynamic, perhaps that disruption was necessary. The opportunity to reveal everything came sooner than expected. Marcus called that afternoon, his voice tight with frustration. "My parents want to have dinner with us this weekend," he said. "Dad says there are things we need to discuss about our future together." I recognized the tone. This wasn't going to be a casual family meal. This was going to be a confrontation. Probably an ultimatum about our relationship and my suitability as a partner for their son. Robert had likely decided it was time to make his position clear, to force Marcus to choose between his family and me. "Of course," I replied, surprising Marcus with my immediate agreement. "I think it's time we all had an honest conversation." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with David's financial documents spread before me, planning exactly how to handle what was coming. For 2.5 years, I'd allowed Robert Rivera to control the narrative about who I was and what I represented. This weekend, that would end. The anticipation was almost unbearable as I prepared for what I knew would be the most important dinner of my relationship with Marcus. I chose my outfit carefully, not trying to impress, but to feel confident and authentic. A simple black dress. That was elegant without being flashy, paired with the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me for my college graduation. Marcus picked me up Saturday evening, clearly nervous about whatever his father had planned. "Just remember," he said as we drove through the increasingly familiar, wealthy neighborhoods, "whatever happens tonight, I'm on your side. We're a team." His words warmed me, but I wondered if he'd still feel that way after learning how much I'd kept from him. As we pulled into the circular driveway of his family's estate, I touched the envelope in my purse containing the financial documents. That would change everything. Tonight, Robert Rivera would learn exactly who he'd been underestimating for the past 2.5 years. Tonight, the real Natalie Brooks would finally stand up. The Rivera family estate felt different that Saturday evening as Marcus and I walked up the stone pathway to the front door. The perfectly manicured gardens and elegant exterior lighting seemed more imposing than welcoming, as if the house itself was preparing for battle. Patricia opened the door before we could ring the bell, her smile polite but strained in a way that immediately put me on edge. "Natalie, Marcus, please come in," she said, her voice carrying an undercurrent of tension that suggested this dinner would be anything but casual. "Your father is waiting in the study. He'd like to speak with both of you before we eat." The study was Robert Rivera's domain, a room designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes and awards from various business organizations. His massive oak desk dominated one corner, while expensive artwork and photographs of construction projects covered the remaining wall space. It was a room that declared its occupant's success and authority without subtlety. Robert stood with his back to us, looking out the window at the city lights below. He was still an imposing figure at 62, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expensive suit tailored to perfection. When he turned to face us, his expression was serious in a way that made my stomach clench with apprehension. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to the leather chairs arranged in front of his desk. The positioning was deliberate, placing Marcus and me in the position of supplicants seeking an audience with someone in authority. I could feel the weight of the financial documents in my purse, knowing they would soon turn this power dynamic on its head. Marcus reached for my hand as we settled into our chairs, his palms slightly damp with nervous perspiration. He clearly sensed that whatever his father had planned wasn't going to be pleasant. Robert remained standing, using his height advantage to maintain psychological control of the conversation. "I've asked you both here tonight because there are things that need to be said," Robert began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Marcus, you're my eldest son, and someday you'll inherit not just Rivera Construction, but the responsibility that comes with our family's reputation and standing in this community." He paused, letting the weight of expectations settle in the room. "That means the choices you make, especially regarding marriage, affect more than just your personal happiness. They impact our family's legacy, our business relationships, and our position in Portland society." I felt Marcus tense beside me, his grip on my hand tightening. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected, and I could see him struggling to process his father's words. Robert's gaze shifted to me, his eyes cold and assessing in a way that made me feel like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be acknowledged. "Natalie," he continued, "I'm sure you're a lovely young woman in your own way, but let's be honest about what this relationship represents. You come from a very different world than ours, with very different expectations and very different resources." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, each word carefully chosen to establish my inferior status. Patricia had entered the room quietly and stood near the doorway, her expression sympathetic but resigned, as if she'd heard this speech before and knew how it would end. "I've done some research into your background," Robert continued, moving, to stand behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "Your parents work blue-collar jobs in a small Montana town. You have no college degree, no significant assets, no family connections that could benefit our business or social standing." Each statement hit like a physical blow, not because they were untrue, but because of the dismissive way he delivered them. He was reducing my entire life to a series of deficits, measuring my worth solely by standards I'd never asked to be judged against. "Furthermore," he said, opening a folder on his desk, "your income as a freelance graphic designer is inconsistent at best. You live in a studio apartment above a bookstore, drive a 10-year-old car, and have no meaningful savings or investments that I can find." Marcus started to stand, his face flushed with anger. "Dad, this is completely inappropriate. You have no right to investigate Natalie's private finances or judge her based on her family's background." Robert held up a hand, his expression stern. "Sit down, Marcus. I'm not finished." His voice carried the authority of a father who expected obedience, and Marcus reluctantly settled back into his chair, though his anger was palpable. "I understand that young people often mistake physical attraction for love," Robert continued, his tone becoming almost clinical in its detachment. "But marriage is a business partnership as much as an emotional commitment. It requires compatibility in values, goals, and yes, social and economic standing." He walked around the desk to stand directly in front of us, his presence dominating the room. "Natalie, I believe you're a genuinely caring person who makes my son happy in the short term. But I also believe you've recognized an opportunity to dramatically improve your circumstances by attaching yourself to our family." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. After years of subtle hints and veiled comments, Robert was finally saying what he'd always believed, that I was a gold digger who had manipulated his son for financial gain. "That's not true," I said quietly, finding my voice for the first time since entering the room. "I love Marcus for who he is, not what his family has." Robert's smile was patronizing, the expression of someone who believed they understood the world better than the naive young woman sitting before them. "I'm sure you've convinced yourself of that," he replied, "but let's examine the facts objectively." He returned to his desk and pulled out what appeared to be a timeline he'd prepared. "You met Marcus at a coffee shop where you were working on a laptop, clearly struggling financially. Within weeks, he was paying for your dinners, your entertainment, helping with your rent when clients didn't pay." Each point was accurate, but Robert's interpretation stripped away all context and genuine emotion. He was presenting our relationship as a calculated transaction rather than the organic connection it had been. "6 months later, you moved in together, eliminating your housing costs," he continued. "Marcus began covering utilities, groceries, and most of your shared expenses while you maintained the pretense of independence with your sporadic freelance work." Marcus was growing angrier by the moment, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching. "Dad, you're completely mischaracterizing our relationship. Natalie and I share expenses based on what we can each afford. That's what couples do." "That's what couples with similar financial positions do," Robert corrected. "When one partner consistently contributes significantly more than the other, it creates an imbalance that ultimately breeds resentment and dependency." Patricia stepped forward, her expression sympathetic but equally misguided. "Natalie, we're not trying to hurt you," she said gently. "We're trying to prevent hurt for everyone involved. These kinds of relationships rarely work long-term because the fundamental inequality creates problems that love alone can't solve." I felt something cold and hard forming in my chest, a mixture of fury and resolve that surprised me with its intensity. For 2.5 years, I'd endured their subtle disapproval and condescending treatment, always trying to prove myself worthy of their acceptance. Now, faced with their direct attack on my character and motivations, something fundamental shifted inside me. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "There is a fundamental inequality in this room, but it's not what you think." Robert's eyebrows rose slightly, as if amused by my attempt to defend myself. "I'm sure you believe that, but the financial realities speak for themselves." I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope David had prepared, setting it on the coffee table between us. The simple manila envelope looked innocuous enough, but I knew it contained information that would shatter every assumption Robert and Patricia had made about me. "Since you've taken the liberty of investigating my finances," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, "I thought you might be interested in seeing the complete picture." Marcus looked at me with confusion, clearly wondering what I was doing. He had no idea what was in the envelope, and I realized that revealing this information would change our relationship as much as it would change his family's perception of me. "What is this?" Robert asked, his tone suggesting he was humoring a child's attempt at misdirection. "Bank statements," I replied simply. "Investment portfolios, property holdings, a complete financial disclosure prepared by my wealth management advisor." The room went completely silent. Patricia's expression shifted from sympathetic condescension to uncertainty, while Robert's confident demeanor wavered slightly. Marcus was staring at me with growing bewilderment, clearly trying to process what I was implying. "Wealth management advisor?" Patricia repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling a strange calm descending over me as I prepared to reveal the truth I'd hidden for so long. David Kim at Premier Financial Services. He's been managing my portfolio since I turned 25 and inherited my grandfather's estate. Robert's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure as he reached for the envelope. I'm sure whatever modest inheritance you received was $12.7 million, I said quietly, cutting him off mid-sentence, as of last Friday's market close. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Patricia actually staggered slightly, reaching for the back of a chair to steady herself. Marcus was staring at me with his mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to process what he'd just heard. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope and began examining the documents inside. I watched his face as he took in the bank statements showing account balances that dwarfed his own net worth, investment portfolios diversified across multiple sectors, and property holdings that included a vacation home in Colorado I'd purchased but never mentioned. This can't be accurate, he said finally, his voice lacking its earlier authority. These numbers? They're impossible. The trust fund was established when I was born, I explained, my voice remarkably steady considering the magnitude of what I was revealing. My grandfather, Thomas Brooks, was one of the early investors in cloud tech systems. When the company went public in the 90s, his initial investment became worth $40 million. Patricia had sunk into a chair, her perfectly composed facade cracking as she tried to process this information. But you live in that tiny apartment, you drive an old car, you dress like someone who wasn't raised to believe that wealth defines worth, I finished for her. My parents taught me that how much money you have matters far less than how you treat people and what you contribute to the world. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Natalie, why didn't you tell me? We've been together for over 2 years and you never said anything about this. I turned to face him, seeing the hurt and confusion in his eyes. This was the moment I'd been dreading, knowing that revealing my wealth might damage the authentic relationship we'd built based on who we were rather than what we owned. Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have, I said, simply. I've seen what money does to relationships, how it changes the way people see you and treat you. What we had was real, built on genuine connection rather than financial compatibility. Robert was still staring at the documents, his worldview clearly shaken by this revelation. But why live so modestly? Why work as a freelance designer when you could afford any lifestyle you wanted? Because the work fulfills me, I replied. Because I enjoy the challenge of building something with my own hands and creativity. Because I've seen what happens to people who live off inherited wealth without purpose or contribution. I stood up, feeling taller and stronger than I had in years. You've spent the past 2.5 years treating me like a gold-digging opportunist who trapped your son for financial gain. You've made assumptions about my character, my motivations, and my worth based entirely on your perception of my economic status. Patricia was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. We had no idea, she whispered. How could we have known? You could have taken the time to actually get to know me, I said, not unkindly, but with complete honesty. You could have looked beyond surface appearances and social classifications to see who I really am as a person. Robert set the documents down with shaking hands, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Natalie, this changes everything. Does it? I asked, genuinely curious about his response. Because I'm exactly the same person I was 10 minutes ago. The only thing that's changed is your knowledge of my bank balance. If that changes how you see me, what does that say about your values? And priorities? Marcus reached for my hand, his expression a mixture of love, admiration, and lingering confusion. I can't believe you kept this secret for so long. Weren't you tempted to tell them when they were treating you badly? I squeezed, his hand grateful for the connection, but knowing we still had difficult conversations ahead of us. Every day, I admitted, but I wanted to prove that I belonged in your life because of who I am, not because of what I inherited. I wanted your parents to accept me based on my character, my love for you, and my contribution to your happiness. Robert was struggling to regain his composure, clearly grappling with the complete reversal of everything he'd believed about me. "The way we've treated you," he said slowly. "The things we've said and assumed. We owe you an enormous apology." "You owe me respect," I corrected gently. "The same respect you'd give to anyone dating your son, regardless of their financial status. An apology is a good start, but it doesn't undo years of condescension and judgment." Patricia wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara slightly. "We thought we were protecting Marcus from someone who might hurt him or take advantage of him. We never imagined that someone from a small town with working-class parents could be anything other than what you assumed," I finished. "That's the problem, Patricia. You never looked past your own prejudices and class-based assumptions to see who I really am." The room fell silent again as everyone processed the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Marcus was still holding my hand, but I could see him struggling with his own emotions about my secrecy. Robert was studying the financial documents again, as if looking at them repeatedly might help him understand how completely wrong he'd been about me. "There's something else you should know," I said, deciding that complete honesty was the only way forward. "The reason I finally decided to reveal this isn't because I want to prove my worth to you. It's because I'm tired of being treated poorly based on false assumptions." I looked directly at Robert, meeting his eyes with steady determination. "If Marcus and I get married, it won't be me moving up in the world financially. It will be him. But that's not why I love him, just as my money isn't why he loves me." The implications of what I was saying slowly dawned on everyone in the room. Not only was I not the gold digger they'd assumed, but I was actually the wealthier partner in the relationship. The power dynamic they'd believed existed was completely reversed. Marcus squeezed my hand tighter, his voice filled with emotion, when he spoke. "I love you exactly as much as I did before I knew about the money, but I wish you'd trusted me enough to share this part of your life." "I was going to tell you," I said honestly. "I was just waiting for the right moment, when I was sure our relationship could handle that kind of revelation. I've seen money destroy too many relationships to take it lightly." Robert stood up slowly, moving around his desk to stand directly in front of me. For a moment, I thought he might be angry about being made to look foolish, but when he spoke, his voice was filled with genuine remorse. "Natalie, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a complete acknowledgement of how wrong I've been about you, about your motivations, and about your character." He paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man accustomed to being right about everything. "I let my assumptions about social class and economic background blind me to who you really are as a person. I treated you poorly based on prejudices I didn't even realize I held, and I'm deeply ashamed of my behavior." Patricia joined him, her earlier tears replaced by a look of determination. "We both are," she said firmly. "We pride ourselves on being good judges of character, but we failed completely when it came to you. We saw what we expected to see instead of looking at who you actually are." The apologies were genuine, but I could see that it would take time for any of us to move past the years of mistrust and misunderstanding. The revelation of my wealth had forced them to confront their own biases, but changing deeply held attitudes would require more than a single evening's conversation. "I appreciate your apologies," I said carefully, "but I need you to understand that this isn't just about money. It's about respect, acceptance, and the basic courtesy of treating someone decently regardless of their background or financial status." Marcus was quiet, still processing everything he'd learned about me and his family's treatment of me. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful but firm. Mom, Dad, I need you to understand something. Even if Natalie had no money at all, even if every assumption you made about her background was accurate, your behavior would still be unacceptable. He stood up, his height matching his father's as he faced them both. The woman I love has been subjected to years of subtle insults, condescending treatment, and outright hostility based on nothing more than your prejudices about her family's economic status. That's not who I thought you were, and it's not the kind of family I want to be part of. Robert's face flushed with shame as he heard his son's assessment of his behavior. Marcus, you thought you were protecting me from someone you never bothered to actually know, Marcus interrupted, his voice steady but filled with disappointment. You made judgments about Natalie's character based entirely on stereotypes and assumptions, and you treated her accordingly. Patricia was crying again, but this time her tears seemed to stem from genuine recognition of how badly they'd behaved. We were so wrong, she whispered, about everything. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness as I watched the Rivera family grapple with the consequences of their prejudices. Part of me was satisfied to see them forced to confront their biases, but another part of me grieved for the relationship we might have had if they'd been willing to see past their assumptions from the beginning. The evening that had started as Robert's attempt to drive me away from his son had instead become a moment of reckoning for all of us. The truth about my financial status had shattered their preconceptions, but it had also revealed uncomfortable truths about their values and character that would take time to address. As we sat in the heavy silence of Robert's study, surrounded by the symbols of his success and authority, I realized that everything between us would be different from this moment forward. The question was whether that change would lead to genuine understanding and respect, or simply a different kind of dysfunction based on my newly revealed wealth. The dinner that Patricia had prepared still waited in the dining room, but none of us seemed to have much appetite for food after the emotional intensity of what had just transpired. The evening had already accomplished more than any meal could, forcing long overdue conversations and revelations that would reshape all of our relationships going forward. The weeks following that explosive dinner at the Rivera estate passed in a strange, suspended animation. Marcus and I returned to our shared apartment that night in virtual silence, both of us processing the magnitude of what had been revealed and what it meant for our relationship moving forward. He didn't ask probing questions about my wealth, didn't demand explanations for why I'd hidden such a fundamental part of my identity for so long. Instead, he simply held me as we lay in bed, his arms wrapped around me as if he was afraid I might disappear into the night. The next morning brought an awkwardness I hadn't anticipated. Marcus moved around our small kitchen, preparing coffee with a careful politeness that felt foreign after years of comfortable intimacy. He was treating me like a stranger, or perhaps like someone he thought he knew, but was now discovering he didn't know at all. The easy banter that usually accompanied our morning routine was replaced by stilted conversation about mundane topics like the weather and his schedule for the day. We need to talk about this, I finally said, setting down my coffee cup and forcing him to meet my eyes. I can see you processing everything, and I know you must have questions about why I kept this from you. Marcus leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful but guarded. I keep trying to reconcile the woman I fell in love with, who worried about rent money and celebrated landing small client contracts, with someone who has more money than my entire family combined. His words stung, though I understood his confusion. I'm the same person, Marcus. The money doesn't change who I am or how I feel about you. It never has. But it changes everything else, he replied, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his way of dealing with stress. Every time I paid for dinner, every time I helped with bills, every time you let me believe I was taking care of you financially, you were essentially playing a role. The accusation hung between us like a physical barrier. I could see how my secrecy appeared from his perspective. how it might seem like deception or manipulation, even though that had never been my intention. I wasn't playing a role, I said carefully. I was being myself, just not sharing every detail of my financial situation. The woman who fell in love with you, who appreciated your kindness and generosity, who built this relationship with you, that's completely real. Marcus shook his head, his frustration evident. But you watched me struggle to afford things for us, watched me worry about money, watched my parents treat you like you were after our family's wealth, and you never said anything. How is that not deceptive? I had no easy answer for his questions because they touched on the very real complexity of my situation. How do you explain that you hid your wealth not out of malice but out of self-protection? How do you make someone understand that money has the power to corrupt relationships in ways that go far beyond simple materialism? I've seen what money does to relationships, I said finally. I've watched friends and family members treat me differently once they knew about my inheritance. Some became overly deferential, others became resentful, and still others saw me as a solution to their financial problems rather than as a person. I moved to stand closer to him, hoping physical proximity might help bridge the emotional distance that seemed to be growing between us. When I met you for the first time in years, I was just Natalie. Not wealthy Natalie or inheritance Natalie, just me. You fell in love with who I am, not what I have. And that was precious to me. Marcus's expression softened slightly, but I could see he was still struggling with the implications of my secrecy. I understand wanting to be loved for yourself. But Natalie, we've been talking about marriage. We've made plans together, discussed our future, and you let me believe we were in completely different financial positions. He was right, and his hurt was justified. In trying to protect our relationship from the complications that money can bring, I had created different complications through my secrecy. The irony wasn't lost on me that my attempt to preserve authenticity had introduced an element of deception into our most intimate relationship. I was going to tell you, I said, knowing how inadequate the explanation sounded. I was waiting for the right moment when I was confident that our relationship was strong enough to handle that kind of revelation. And when exactly would that have been? Marcus asked, his voice carrying an edge of sarcasm I'd rarely heard from him. After we were married? After we had children? How long were you planning to maintain this fiction? The word fiction hit me like a physical blow because it suggested that he saw our entire relationship as built on false premises. It wasn't fiction, Marcus. My feelings for you, our connection, everything we've built together, that's all completely real. He turned away from me, staring out the kitchen window at the busy street below. I keep thinking about all the times you let me pay for things. All the conversations about budgeting and being careful with money. All the moments when you could have told me the truth but chose not to. I could hear the pain in his voice. The sense of betrayal that came not from malicious deception, but from the discovery that someone you love has been withholding a fundamental aspect of their identity. It was exactly the kind of complication I'd hoped to avoid by keeping my wealth secret. But here it was anyway, threatening to destroy the very thing I'd been trying to protect. Marcus, please look at me, I said, waiting until he turned around to continue. I made a mistake by not telling you sooner. I can see how hurtful my secrecy has been, and I'm sorry for that. But I need you to understand that everything else about our relationship, everything that matters, has been completely honest. He studied my face for a long moment, and I could see the internal battle between his hurt at my deception and his love for the person he thought he knew. I need some time to process this, he said finally. Not just the money, but what it means that you felt you couldn't trust me with the truth. The word trust cut deep because it highlighted the fundamental irony of my situation. In trying to protect our relationship from the complications that money can bring, I had introduced the far more damaging complication of broken trust. My attempt to preserve authenticity had created its own form of deception. Over the following days, Marcus threw himself into his work with an intensity that felt like avoidance. He left early each morning and returned late each evening, maintaining polite conversation but avoiding the deeper discussions we needed to have. I gave him space while struggling with my own conflicted emotions about how to repair the damage my secrecy had caused. During this tense period, Amanda called to check in, sensing something was wrong from my subdued tone during our recent conversations. When I explained what had happened with Marcus's family and the revelation of my wealth, her response was immediate and fierce. "Wait, let me understand this correctly," she said, her voice rising with indignation. "His parents spent years treating you like garbage because they thought you were poor, and now he's upset with you because you're actually rich. What kind of backwards logic is that?" Her perspective, coming from someone who had known me before, I had money and after, helped clarify some of my own confusion about the situation. "It's not that simple, Amanda. He feels like I deceived him by not sharing something so fundamental about my life. But you're the same person you've always been," she argued. "You've never acted entitled or spoiled. You've never used money to solve problems or buy people's affection. If anything, you've been almost pathologically committed to living authentically despite your wealth." Her words resonated because they reflected my own understanding of my choices, but I could also see Marcus's perspective. From his point of view, I had allowed him to make assumptions about our relative financial positions that influenced how he behaved in our relationship. "He feels like I let him play a role that wasn't necessary," I explained. "Like I allowed him to be the provider when I could have been providing for both of us." Amanda was quiet for a moment before responding. "Natalie, honey, the fact that you have money doesn't obligate you to spend it on other people or to reveal your financial status to anyone, even someone you're in a relationship with. You're allowed to have boundaries around your wealth." Her support was comforting, but it didn't resolve the fundamental issue between Marcus and me. Trust, once damaged, requires intentional effort to rebuild, and I wasn't sure how to bridge the gap that my secrecy had created. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when Marcus returned home one evening to find me crying over a phone call with my parents. They had heard about the situation through Amanda, who had called them out of concern for my well-being, and their response had been characteristically supportive, but also heartbreaking. "We raised you to be humble and to judge people by their character, not their bank accounts," my mother had said. "If this young man can't appreciate those values, then maybe he's not the right person for you. Money or no money." My father's perspective had been even more direct. "You don't owe anyone access to your inheritance, Natalie. That money is yours to share or not share as you see fit. If he's more concerned about you having money than about you as a person, then his priorities are wrong." Their unwavering support had reduced me to tears, partly from gratitude and partly from the recognition that I might lose the relationship I'd worked so hard to protect through my secrecy. Marcus sat down beside me on the couch, his earlier distance replaced by immediate concern. "What's wrong? What happened?" Through my tears, I explained the conversation with my parents and their perspective on the situation. As I spoke, I could see something shifting in Marcus's expression, a recognition that perhaps he had been viewing the situation too narrowly. "Your parents are right," he said quietly. "You don't owe me or anyone else access to your financial information. I've been so focused on feeling deceived that I haven't considered how difficult it must have been for you to navigate this." His acknowledgement opened the door for the honest conversation we'd been avoiding since the night at his parents' house. For the first time since the revelation, we talked openly about my relationship with money, my fears about how wealth changes, relationships, and the specific experiences that had shaped my decision to keep my inheritance private. "I watched my college roommate's boyfriend start treating her differently after he found out her family had money," I explained. "Suddenly he expected her to pay for everything, and when she didn't, he accused her of being stingy and selfish. Their relationship became about her money instead of about them as people." Marcus listened intently as I shared story after story about relationships that had been corrupted by wealth, either through resentment, entitlement, or the simple fact that money creates power imbalances that can be difficult to navigate. I fell in love with you because you saw me as an equal, I continued. You treated me with respect and kindness without any ulterior motives. When you helped with bills or paid for dinner, it was because you wanted to take care of me, not because you thought I needed you to. But I did think you needed me to, Marcus said, his voice filled with a new understanding. Part of what I loved about our relationship was feeling like I was contributing something valuable, like I was taking care of someone I loved. This admission revealed the heart of his struggle with my revelation. His identity as a provider and protector had been challenged by the discovery that I didn't need his financial support. In hiding my wealth, I had inadvertently allowed him to build part of his self-worth around a role that wasn't necessary. You do take care of me, I said, reaching for his hand. Every day, in dozens of ways that have nothing to do with money. You listen when I'm frustrated with work. You make me laugh when I'm stressed. You hold me when I'm sad. None of that changes because of my bank balance. We talked through the night, working through the complex emotions that my revelation had triggered for both of us. Marcus acknowledged that his hurt came partly from wounded pride and partly from a sense that he had been performing a role based on incomplete information. I acknowledged that my secrecy, however well-intentioned, had created the very complications I'd been trying to avoid. By morning, we had reached a new understanding. My wealth was a fact that would require ongoing navigation in our relationship, but it didn't have to define or destroy what we'd built together. More importantly, we had established a commitment to complete honesty going forward, recognizing that trust could only be rebuilt through consistent transparency. The situation with his parents proved more complex to resolve. Robert called several times in the days following our confrontation, leaving voicemails that alternated between elaborate apologies and requests to meet again so he could make amends properly. Patricia sent flowers with a note expressing her shame at how she had treated me and her hope that we could start over. Their attempts at reconciliation were clearly genuine, but I found myself struggling with how to respond. Years of subtle hostility and condescension couldn't be erased with apologies and flower arrangements, especially when those apologies seemed motivated primarily by the discovery of my wealth, rather than by genuine recognition of their poor behavior. They're trying, Marcus said one evening as we discussed how to handle his parents' overtures. It's awkward and probably inadequate, but they're genuinely remorseful about how they treated you. I understood his desire to believe his parents were capable of change, but I remained skeptical about their motivations. Are they sorry they treated me badly, or are they sorry they misjudged my financial status? Because those are very different things. It was a fair question, and one that Marcus couldn't easily answer. The timing of their remorse, coming immediately, after learning about my wealth, suggested that their change of heart was at least partially motivated by embarrassment at having been so wrong about me, rather than by genuine recognition of their prejudices. I think it's both, he said finally. They're embarrassed about being wrong, but I also think seeing those financial documents forced them to confront their own biases in a way they couldn't ignore. Amanda's perspective, when I shared it with her, was characteristically blunt. They spent years treating you like trash because they thought you were poor, and now they want to be best friends because you're rich. That tells you everything you need to know about their character. Her assessment was harsh, but not entirely unfair. The Rivera family's dramatic change in attitude toward me suggested that their acceptance was contingent on my financial status, rather than on who I was as a person. That kind of conditional respect felt hollow and unsustainable. Marcus arranged a dinner at a neutral restaurant where we could meet with his parents in a less emotionally charged environment than their home. I agreed reluctantly, partly out of love for Marcus and partly out of curiosity about whether Robert and Patricia were capable of genuine change. The evening was awkward from the moment we sat down. Robert and Patricia were clearly nervous, treating me with an exaggerated courtesy that felt almost as uncomfortable as their previous hostility. They asked careful questions about my background and my family with the kind of respectful interest they should have shown from the beginning. "We want you to know how deeply sorry we are," Patricia said over appetizers, her voice sincere but stilted. "We made assumptions about you that were completely unfair and unfounded, and we treated you accordingly. There's no excuse for our behavior." Robert nodded emphatically, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious discomfort. "We pride ourselves on being good judges of character, but we failed completely when it came to you. We let our preconceptions blind us to who you really are." Their apologies were more elaborate than necessary, which paradoxically made them feel less genuine. I found myself longing for the straightforward hostility of their previous treatment, which had at least been honest about their feelings, rather than this performative remorse that seemed calculated to repair their relationship with their son. "I appreciate your apologies," I said carefully, "but I need you to understand that this isn't just about me. Your behavior revealed attitudes about class and social status that affect how you treat all kinds of people." The observation made both of them uncomfortable, which suggested that they hadn't fully processed the implications of their prejudices beyond how they affected me specifically. They were sorry for misjudging me, but they hadn't necessarily examined the underlying biases that had led to that misjudgment. Marcus tried to facilitate a meaningful conversation, but the dinner remained stilted and artificial. His parents were trying too hard to demonstrate their changed attitudes, while I struggled to move past years of accumulated resentment and mistrust. By the end of the evening, it was clear that rebuilding our relationship would require much more than a single apologetic dinner. The drive home was quiet, both Marcus and I processing the awkwardness of the evening and what it meant for our future as a family unit. His parents' attempts at reconciliation were genuine, but incomplete, addressing the symptoms of their prejudice without fully examining its roots. "They're trying," Marcus said again, but this time his voice carried less conviction than before. "Yes, they are," I agreed. "But trying and succeeding are different things, and I'm not sure they understand what successful reconciliation would actually require." The truth was that Robert and Patricia's dramatic change in behavior towards me, while preferable to their previous hostility, felt almost as problematic in its own way. Their acceptance was contingent on my wealth, rather than on genuine respect for me as a person, which meant it was fundamentally unstable and conditional. As we pulled into our apartment complex, I realized that the revelation of my wealth had solved one problem while creating several others. The immediate crisis with Marcus's family had been resolved, but the underlying issues of trust, authenticity, and conditional acceptance would require much more time and effort to address. The question now was whether any of us had the patience and commitment necessary to do that work, or whether the damage caused by years of mistrust and months of secrecy was too extensive to repair. Only time would tell if the truth about my financial status had set us free or simply created new forms of bondage. The morning after our awkward dinner with his parents, Marcus left for work with a distant expression that had become all too familiar over the past month. Our relationship felt like it was suspended in amber, neither moving forward nor completely falling apart, but frozen in a state of careful politeness that exhausted both of us. I found myself missing the easy intimacy we'd shared before money became a complicating factor in our lives. I decided to take a drive to clear my head, ending up at the Columbia River Gorge, where Marcus and I had hiked on one of our first dates. The familiar trails and stunning vistas should have been comforting, but instead, they highlighted how much distance had grown between us since that carefree time when our biggest concern was whether we'd packed enough water for the hike. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Thompson, my former art professor from community college, who had become a mentor and friend over the years. She was visiting Portland for a gallery opening and wanted to meet for lunch. Kat had always been perceptive about people and relationships, and I found myself hoping her outside perspective might help me navigate the current crisis. We met at a small bistro in the Pearl District, and Kat's warm embrace immediately made me feel less alone with my complicated emotions. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and paint-stained fingers that spoke to her ongoing commitment to her art, despite her teaching responsibilities. Her presence reminded me of who I'd been before I got caught up in the Rivera family drama. "You look tired, honey," she said, studying my face with the same attention she brought to her artwork. "And not the good kind of tired that comes from working hard on something you love. This is the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying emotional weight that's too heavy for one person." Over lunch, I found myself telling her everything. The years of subtle hostility from Marcus's parents, the careful way I'd hidden my wealth, the explosive confrontation that had revealed my financial status, and the complicated aftermath that was threatening to destroy the relationship I'd worked so hard to protect. Kat listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing me to process my emotions through storytelling. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Let me ask you something," she said finally. "If you had to do it all over again, would you still hide your wealth from Marcus and his family?" The question forced me to examine my choices more honestly than I'd been willing to do since the revelation. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me thinks everything would have been simpler if I'd been upfront from the beginning. But another part of me believes that Marcus fell in love with who I really am precisely because money wasn't a factor." Kat nodded, understanding the complexity of my dilemma. "Here's what I've learned in 63 years of living and 35 years of teaching young people about art and life. Authenticity isn't about revealing every detail of your personal history to everyone you meet. It's about being true to your core values and treating others with honesty and respect." She leaned forward, her expression serious but kind. "You've been authentic in every way that matters. You've lived according to your values. You've treated people well, and you've built genuine relationships based on who you are rather than what you have. The fact that you didn't share your financial information doesn't make you inauthentic." Her perspective offered a different framework for understanding my choices, one that was less focused on disclosure and more focused on integrity. "But Marcus feels like I deceived him by letting him make assumptions about our relative financial positions." "Marcus feels challenged in his identity as a provider and protector," Kat corrected gently. "That's a very different thing than being deceived. His hurt isn't really about your secrecy. It's about discovering that a role he valued in your relationship wasn't necessary." The insight was illuminating because it explained why our conversations about trust and honesty hadn't seemed to address the real source of Marcus's discomfort. His struggle wasn't primarily about my keeping secrets. It was about reconceptualizing his place in our relationship now that he knew I didn't need his financial support. "What do I do with that information?" I asked, feeling both relieved to understand the problem better and overwhelmed by its complexity. Kat smiled, the expression of someone who had helped many students work through difficult personal challenges. "You help him understand that being needed isn't the same as being wanted, and that wanting someone is actually much more meaningful than needing them." The conversation with Kat shifted something fundamental in my understanding of the situation. Instead of focusing on defending my choice to keep my wealth private, I needed to help Marcus understand that his value in my life had never been dependent on his ability to provide for me financially. That evening, I waited for Marcus to come home with a new sense of clarity about what I wanted to say to him. When he walked through the door, looking tired and preoccupied, I asked him to sit down so we could have an important conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding feeling like you were playing an unnecessary role in our relationship," I began, choosing my words carefully. "And I want you to understand something crucial about why I fell in love with you." Marcus settled onto the couch beside me, his expression guarded but attentive. The careful distance he'd been maintaining felt less pronounced, as if he was also ready for a different kind of conversation than the ones we'd been having. When I met you, I had already learned to be completely self-sufficient, I continued. I could take care of myself financially, emotionally, and practically. I didn't need anyone to rescue me or solve my problems or provide for me in any material way. I paused, making sure he was understanding the significance of what I was saying. That means that everything you've done for me, every kindness and gesture of care, has been because I wanted you in my life, not because I needed you there. Marcus's expression began to shift as he processed the implications of my words. I never thought about it that way, he said quietly. Marcus, when you paid for dinner or helped with bills, it wasn't because I couldn't afford those things, myself. It was because I loved you and enjoyed letting you take care of me in those ways. When you worried about my financial security, it wasn't because I was actually insecure, but because your concern showed how much you cared about my well-being. I reached for his hand, relieved when he didn't pull away. Every generous thing you've done for me has been a choice, not an obligation. And that makes it infinitely more meaningful than if I had actually needed your help. The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. Marcus began to understand that my financial independence didn't diminish his importance in my life, and I began to appreciate how my secrecy had unintentionally undermined his sense of purpose in our partnership. Over the following weeks, we worked together to rebuild trust and establish new patterns of communication. Marcus started sharing more about his own relationship with money and class, revealing insecurities about measuring up to his successful father that I hadn't fully understood before. I've always felt like I needed to prove myself worthy of the Rivera name, he admitted one evening as we walked through our neighborhood. Joining Dad's construction business felt like taking the easy path, so I chose architecture to make my own way. But part of me has always worried that I'm not successful enough, not accomplished enough. His vulnerability helped me understand why my wealth had been so threatening to his self-concept. In his mind, his value as a partner was tied to his ability to provide and protect, and discovering that I didn't need either created an identity crisis that went far beyond our relationship. Success isn't about accumulating wealth or status, I said, echoing conversations I'd had with my parents about finding meaning beyond material achievements. It's about using your talents to contribute something meaningful to the world and building relationships based on genuine care and respect. We spent hours talking about our individual values and goals, discovering areas of alignment we hadn't fully explored during the years when financial considerations seemed straightforward. Marcus's passion for sustainable architecture aligned perfectly with my interest in supporting environmental causes through philanthropy. His desire to create beautiful, functional spaces complemented my appreciation for art and design. As our key relationship began to heal, the situation with his parents remained complicated. Robert called regularly, alternating between awkward attempts at friendly conversation and obvious efforts to learn more about my financial situation. His newfound interest in my opinions and experiences felt performative rather than genuine. Patricia took a different approach, inviting me to lunch with her friends and proudly introducing me as her son's accomplished girlfriend. The complete reversal from her previous behavior was jarring, and I found myself missing the honesty of her former disapproval. "They're overcompensating," Amanda observed when I described their changed behavior during one of our regular phone calls. "They feel guilty about how they treated you, but they haven't actually examined why they treated you that way in the first place." Her assessment aligned with my own observations. Robert and Patricia's apologies focused on their mistake in judging my financial status, rather than on their underlying prejudices about class and social worth. They were sorry for being wrong about me specifically, but they hadn't necessarily changed their attitudes about people in general. The test of their sincerity came unexpectedly when Marcus's younger brother James brought his new girlfriend to a family dinner. Sarah was a kindergarten teacher from a working-class background, and I watched with interest to see how Robert and Patricia would treat someone who actually fit the profile they had initially assumed applied to me. The dinner was held at the Rivera estate, and I observed the family dynamics with new awareness of their significance. Sarah was polite and respectful, clearly nervous about meeting her boyfriend's family, and I could see myself in her eager attempts to make a good impression. Robert's questions to Sarah were similar to the ones he had initially asked me, but his tone carried the same subtle condescension I remembered from my early interactions with the family. When Sarah mentioned her parents' occupations and her own student loan debt, I saw Patricia exchange a look with Robert that was all too familiar. "Sarah seems lovely," Patricia said to me quietly during a lull in the conversation. "But I do worry about James getting serious with someone who isn't quite ready for our lifestyle." The comment revealed that their prejudices hadn't changed at all. They had simply made an exception for me based on my financial status. Their acceptance remained conditional and superficial, extending only to those who met their economic criteria for social acceptability. Marcus noticed the interaction as well, and his expression grew troubled as he observed his parents treating Sarah with the same dismissive courtesy they had once shown me. When we left that evening, he was quiet and thoughtful in a way that suggested he was processing uncomfortable realizations about his family's character. "They haven't changed at all, have they?" he said as we drove home through the familiar wealthy neighborhoods surrounding his parents' estate. "Not fundamentally." I agreed. "They've changed how they treat me, but not why they treated me poorly in the first place." The recognition was painful for Marcus, who had hoped that his parents' apologies represented genuine growth rather than situational adjustment. Seeing them dismiss Sarah for the same reasons they had initially dismissed me forced him to confront the reality of their prejudices. "I can't keep making excuses for them," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I've been telling myself that they were just protective of me, that they would come around once they got to know you better. But they never tried to get to know you, and they're not trying to get to know Sarah either." This realization marked another important shift in our relationship. Marcus began to separate his love for his parents from his acceptance of their behavior, creating boundaries that protected our relationship from their ongoing prejudices. We started declining some family invitations and limiting our exposure to situations where Robert and Patricia's attitudes created tension. Marcus also began speaking up more directly when his parents made dismissive comments about people from different economic backgrounds. "I won't be part of conversations that judge people based on their bank accounts or family backgrounds," he told them during one particularly uncomfortable family gathering. "If you can't treat people with basic respect, regardless of their financial status, then we won't be joining you for these events." His willingness to confront his parents on their behavior was both validating and attractive. For the first time since our relationship began, I felt like Marcus was choosing me over his family's approval, standing up for principles that mattered more than maintaining family harmony. The changes in our relationship extended beyond dealing with his parents' prejudices. Marcus began participating more actively in discussions about how to use my wealth in meaningful ways, contributing his architectural expertise to conversations about philanthropic projects and sustainable development initiatives. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation focused on affordable housing design," he said one evening as we reviewed information about various charitable organizations. "There's such a need for beautiful, functional housing that people with modest incomes can actually afford." His idea excited me because it represented a way to combine his professional skills with my financial resources to address a genuine social need. For the first time since my wealth had been revealed, we were talking about it as a tool for positive impact rather than as a source of relationship complications. We spent several weeks researching housing initiatives and meeting with experts in affordable development. Marcus's enthusiasm for the project reminded me of why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. His combination of idealism and practical skills, his desire to create something meaningful rather than simply accumulating wealth or status. The foundation became a joint project that helped us develop new patterns of collaboration and shared purpose. Instead of my money being a source of awkwardness or inequality between us, it became a resource we could use together to make a positive difference in the world. As our relationship strengthened and found new equilibrium, I reflected on how much we had both grown through the crisis of revelation and reconciliation. Marcus had learned to value himself for qualities that went beyond his ability to provide financially, while I had learned the importance of vulnerability and trust in intimate relationships. The situation with his parents remained imperfect, but we had established boundaries that protected our relationship while maintaining basic family connections. Robert and Patricia continued their performative acceptance of me while revealing their unchanged prejudices toward others, but their attitudes no longer had the power to hurt me in the same way. Most importantly, Marcus and I had developed a deeper understanding of each other's values and insecurities, creating a foundation for marriage that was more solid than anything we could have built on the surface-level compatibility of our early relationship. The revelation of my wealth, which had initially seemed like it might destroy everything we had built together, had instead forced us to examine what we truly valued in each other and in our shared future. We emerged from the crisis with greater honesty, stronger communication skills, and a clearer sense of our individual and collective purposes. As I prepared for the next phase of our relationship, I felt confident that we could handle whatever challenges arose, armed with hard-won wisdom about the difference between needing someone and choosing them, between conditional acceptance and genuine love. 6 months after the explosive revelation at the Rivera family dinner, Marcus and I stood in the community center we had helped fund through our newly established affordable housing foundation. The building buzzed with activity as families toured. Model apartments designed with Marcus's architectural vision and built with sustainable materials that would keep costs low while maintaining dignity and beauty. A young mother named Elena walked through one of the units with her 2 children, her eyes bright with hope as she examined the efficient kitchen layout and the large windows that filled the space with natural light. "My kids could each have their own room," she murmured to the housing counselor, her voice filled with wonder at the possibility of stability her family had been seeking for years. Marcus stood beside me, watching Elena's reaction with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose work was making a tangible difference in people's lives. This project had become more than just a way to use my inherited wealth purposefully. It had become the foundation for a partnership that neither of us could have imagined when we first met in that Portland coffee shop. "She reminds me of my mother," Marcus said quietly, observing Elena's careful attention to practical details like storage space and proximity to public transportation. Always focused on what would be best for her family, always making the most of whatever resources were available. His comment surprised me because Marcus rarely spoke about his mother in terms that acknowledged her practical wisdom rather than her social anxieties. The months of working together on the foundation had given him new perspective on the difference between survival and status, between genuine accomplishment and inherited privilege. The community center was hosting an open house to celebrate the completion of our first housing development, and the event had drawn interest from city officials, other nonprofit organizations, and families hoping to qualify for future units. Local news stations had covered the story, focusing on the innovative design elements that made quality housing affordable without sacrificing beauty or functionality. Robert and Patricia arrived precisely on schedule, dressed impeccably and clearly uncomfortable with the diverse crowd that filled the community center. I watched them navigate the room with polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, making small talk with city council members while carefully avoiding extended conversations with the families who would actually live in the housing we had built. "Natalie, dear, this is quite an impressive turnout," Patricia said, approaching me with the kind of bright enthusiasm she now used whenever discussing my philanthropic activities. "You and Marcus have really created something wonderful here." Her praise felt hollow because I could see her surveying the crowd with the same evaluative gaze she had once turned on me. The working-class families, the single mothers, the elderly, Residents on fixed incomes all received the same polite acknowledgement without genuine engagement or interest. Robert joined us, shaking hands with Marcus with obvious pride in his son's achievement. "The architecture is really outstanding," he said, and I could hear the genuine appreciation in his voice for Marcus's professional skills. "You've managed to create spaces that feel spacious and elegant despite the budget constraints." "Thank you, Dad," Marcus replied, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Over the months of working on this project, he had become increasingly aware of his parents' inability to see the people we were serving as anything more than statistics or charity cases. The moment that crystallized everything came when Elena approached our small group, her children trailing behind her as she looked for someone to thank for the opportunity her family had been given. She was holding the keys to her new apartment, having just completed the final paperwork that would allow her family to move in the following week. "Excuse me," she said, her voice slightly nervous but determined. "I wanted to thank whoever is responsible for this program. My family has been on waiting lists for decent housing for 3 years, and this apartment is going to change everything for us." Marcus stepped forward immediately, his face lighting up with genuine warmth. "Elena, right? I remember meeting you during the application process. How do the spaces feel now that you've had a chance to walk through them?" "Like a miracle," she replied simply, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "My son is starting middle school next month, and for the first time, he'll have his own space to do homework. My daughter can have friends over without being embarrassed about where we live." Patricia's response to Elena's gratitude was polite, but distant, the kind of acknowledgement someone might give to a person providing a service rather than someone whose life had been meaningfully impacted by our work. Robert nodded approvingly, but with the detached benevolence of someone viewing poverty from a comfortable distance. The contrast between Marcus's genuine engagement with Elena and his parents' performative charity was stark and illuminating. Marcus asked about her children's interests, listened to her concerns about the neighborhood schools, and offered practical suggestions based on his knowledge of the area. His parents smiled and made appropriate sounds of encouragement, while clearly waiting for the conversation to end so they could return to networking with other donors and officials. After Elena moved on to explore more of the community center, Marcus turned to his parents with an expression I had never seen before. It was a mixture of disappointment and clarity, as if he was finally seeing them with complete honesty for the first time. "Did you hear what she said about her son having space to do homework?" he asked them, his voice carrying an edge of challenge. "Did you understand what that means for a family that's been living in overcrowded conditions?" Patricia looked confused by the intensity of his question. "Of course, dear. It's wonderful that these families are getting help. You should be very proud of what you've accomplished." "I am proud," Marcus replied, "but not because we're helping these families as if they're different from us in some fundamental way. I'm proud because we're addressing a basic human need for safe, dignified housing that every person deserves, regardless of their income level." Robert frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Marcus, no one is suggesting these people don't deserve decent housing. We're here supporting your project, aren't we? You're here because it reflects well on the family to be associated with successful philanthropy," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "But you're not here because you actually care about Elena or her children as individuals worthy of respect and consideration." The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge that couldn't be ignored or deflected. Patricia's face flushed with embarrassment, while Robert's expression hardened with the defensive anger of someone being confronted with uncomfortable truths about themselves. "That's completely unfair," Patricia protested. "We've always taught you to care about people less fortunate than ourselves. We've donated to charities. We've supported community causes." "You've written checks," Marcus corrected, "but you've never actually engaged with people whose experiences are different from yours." You've maintained your distance while feeling good about your generosity. I watched this confrontation unfold with a mixture of pride in Marcus's courage and sadness for the pain it was causing him to finally acknowledge his parents' limitations. This was the conversation we had been building toward since the night. My wealth was revealed, the moment when Marcus would have to choose between enabling his parents' prejudices and standing up for his own values. Your mother and I have worked hard for everything we have, Robert said, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone whose worldview was being challenged. If that success allows us to help others, I don't see why our motivations matter, as long as people are being helped. Because charity without respect is just another form of condescension, Marcus replied, and I could hear echoes of our many conversations about the purpose and ethics of philanthropy. Because treating people as objects of pity, rather than as equals deserving of dignity, perpetuates the very attitudes that create inequality in the first place. The argument was becoming more heated, drawing curious glances from other attendees at the open house. I stepped closer to Marcus, not to mediate the conflict, but to show my support for his willingness to confront his parents' attitudes directly. We should probably continue this conversation somewhere more private, I suggested, nodding toward a small office space that Marcus had been using for project coordination. The four of us moved to the office, where the conversation could continue without creating a scene at what was supposed to be a celebration of community achievement. Once the door closed, Robert's composure cracked slightly, revealing the frustration he had been suppressing. I don't understand what's happened to you, Marcus, he said, his voice carrying the bewilderment of a parent whose child had grown beyond their comprehension. We raised you to be successful, to contribute to your community, to make something of yourself. And you have. But now you seem angry with us for the very values that made your success possible. Marcus sat down heavily in one of the office chairs, suddenly looking exhausted by the emotional weight of confronting his parents. I'm not angry about success, Dad. I'm disappointed that you equate financial achievement with moral worth, that you judge people's value based on their economic status rather than their character. That's not what we do, Patricia insisted, but her protest lacked conviction. We've always been generous to people in need. You've been generous to people you consider beneath you, Marcus corrected gently. There's a difference between helping someone you see as an equal who happens to need assistance and helping someone you see as fundamentally different from yourself. The distinction he was drawing reflected months of conversations we had shared about the philosophy behind our foundation work. We had tried to structure our programs in ways that preserved dignity and agency for the families we served, treating housing as a human right rather than as charity for the deserving poor. When you first met Natalie, Marcus continued, you treated her poorly because you assumed she was financially inferior to our family. When you learned about her wealth, you immediately changed your behavior toward her. But your attitude toward Sarah, toward Elena, toward anyone who actually fits the profile you initially assigned to Natalie, that hasn't changed at all. Robert's face darkened with embarrassment and anger at having his prejudices laid out so clearly. We apologized to Natalie for our mistakes. We've tried to make amends for our initial misunderstandings. You apologized for being wrong about her financial status, I said, speaking up for the first time since we had entered the office. But you never apologized for the attitudes that made you treat me poorly in the first place. And you certainly haven't changed those attitudes when it comes to other people. Patricia looked genuinely confused, as if she couldn't understand the difference between apologizing for a factual error and examining the underlying prejudices that had led to that error. But we were wrong about you, she said. Doesn't that prove we're capable of changing our minds when presented with new information? It proves you're capable of making exceptions, Marcus replied, but not that you're capable of changing your fundamental beliefs about what makes people worthy of respect and consideration. The conversation continued for another hour, with Robert and Patricia alternating between defensive justifications of their behavior and bewildered requests for Marcus to explain what they had done wrong. Their inability to see beyond their own perspective, to understand how their attitudes affected others, became more apparent with each exchange. Eventually, Marcus stood up with the finality of someone who had reached a difficult decision. "I love you both, and I'll always be grateful for the opportunities you've given me. But I can't continue to pretend that I don't see how you treat people you consider beneath your social status." "What does that mean?" Patricia asked, her voice small and uncertain. "It means that Natalie and I will be limiting our participation in family events where we're expected to watch you treat people with condescension and judgment," Marcus said firmly. "It means we won't be bringing our children, when we have them, to gatherings where they'll learn that a person's worth is determined by their bank account." The reference to future children seemed to hit Robert and Patricia harder than anything else Marcus had said. The possibility that they might have limited access to their grandchildren because of their attitudes towards social class forced them to confront the real consequences of their prejudices. "Marcus, please," Patricia said, tears forming in her eyes. "We never intended to hurt anyone. We just wanted what was best for you." "I know you did," Marcus replied, his voice gentler but still firm. "But your definition of what's best was based on maintaining social status rather than developing character. And that's not the foundation I want for my own family." We left the office and rejoined the open house celebration, but the energy between Marcus and his parents had fundamentally shifted. They stayed for another hour, making polite conversation with other attendees but clearly processing the implications of their son's ultimatum. As the evening wound down and families began to leave with information packets and application forms for future housing developments, Marcus and I found ourselves alone in the community center with Elena and her children. Her son was playing with a tablet in the corner while her daughter showed us drawings she had made of how she planned to decorate her new bedroom. "This is what it's all about," Marcus said quietly, watching Elena's daughter explain her artistic vision with the serious concentration of a professional interior designer, creating opportunities for people to build the lives they want for themselves and their families. Elena overheard his comment and approached us with a smile that transformed her entire face. "You know what the best part is?" she said. "It's not just the apartment, though that's wonderful. It's feeling like someone believed we deserved something beautiful." Her words captured exactly what we had been trying to explain to Robert and Patricia. The foundation's impact wasn't just about providing affordable housing. It was about affirming the dignity and worth of every family we served. As we drove home that night, Marcus was quiet, but not in the tense, conflicted way that had characterized his silences during the months following my revelation. This was the contemplative quiet of someone who had made a difficult but necessary decision and was at peace with the consequences. "Do you think I was too hard on them?" he asked as we stopped at a red light near our apartment. "I think you were honest with them," I replied. "Maybe for the first time in your adult life." He reached over and took my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm in a gesture that had become familiar during our months of rebuilding trust and intimacy. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. "Not just the foundation, but learning to see my parents clearly, learning to stand up for what I believe in." "You could have," I said, squeezing his hand. "But I'm glad you didn't have to." The following months brought the changes Marcus had promised. We declined invitations to family gatherings where Robert and Patricia's attitudes created tension. Instead, building relationships with Marcus's extended family members who shared our values about treating people with dignity, regardless of their economic circumstances. James, Marcus's younger brother, proved to be a surprising ally in this process. His relationship with Sarah, the kindergarten teacher, had deepened despite his parents' subtle disapproval, and he began joining us for holidays and celebrations that focused on genuine connection rather than social performance. Robert and Patricia made several attempts to repair their relationship with Marcus, but their efforts continued to focus on surface-level changes rather than the fundamental examination of their attitudes that would be necessary for real reconciliation. They attended charity events and made larger donations to various causes, but their interactions with service staff, with people from different economic backgrounds, with anyone they perceived as socially inferior, remained unchanged. Marcus grieved the loss of the close relationship he had once had with his parents, but he also felt liberated from the constant tension of trying to bridge the gap between their values and his own. Our relationship deepened as we built a shared life based on mutual respect, common purpose, and the kind of authentic partnership that can only exist between people who choose each other freely. A year after the community center open house, Marcus proposed to me at the site of our second housing development, which was nearing completion. He had designed a small garden space in the center of the complex where children could play and neighbors could gather, and he asked me to marry him, surrounded by the tangible evidence of what we could accomplish together. Our wedding was small and deliberately intimate, held at a vineyard in the Willamette Valley, with close friends and family members who celebrated our love rather than our social or economic compatibility. Elena and her children attended, along with several other families from our housing programs, their presence a reminder that the most meaningful relationships transcend traditional social boundaries. Robert and Patricia came to the wedding, but their discomfort with the guest list and the casual elegance of the celebration highlighted how far apart we had grown. They remained polite but distant, treating the occasion as a social obligation, rather than as a joyful celebration of their son's happiness. As Marcus and I exchanged vows in the golden light of a Pacific Northwest sunset, surrounded by people who loved us for who we were rather than what we represented, I felt profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought us to this moment. The revelation of my wealth, which had initially seemed like it might destroy our relationship, had instead forced us to examine what we truly valued in each other and in our shared future. We had learned that genuine partnership isn't about financial compatibility or social status. It's about shared values, mutual respect, and the willingness to grow together through whatever challenges arise. We had discovered that love isn't diminished by difficult conversations or family conflicts. It's strengthened by the commitment to choose each other again and again, especially when that choice requires courage. Most importantly, we had found a way to use the privileges we had been given, whether through inheritance or family connection or professional success, to create opportunities for others to build lives of dignity and purpose. The foundation work that had begun as a way to channel my wealth into meaningful impact had become the cornerstone of a marriage based on shared mission rather than mere compatibility. As we danced to our first song as husband and wife, I looked out at our guests and saw the community we had chosen to build around ourselves. It wasn't defined by economic status or social position, but by the common commitment to treating every person with respect and creating a world where everyone has access to the basic requirements for a flourishing life. The champagne toast that Robert had given at our reception was polite and appropriate, but it was Elena's words that captured what our marriage meant to the people whose lives we hoped to touch. "Thank you for showing us that love isn't about what you can get from someone," she had said, raising her glass toward Marcus and me. "It's about what you can build together when you believe in each other and in something bigger than yourselves." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.